Good evening and welcome to Let's Just Talk. I am your host, Hammi. Tonight's topic is the implications and effects of China's investments in Central Asia and Africa for those partner countries. So, to offer some perspective on this important topic, we are joined by esteemed and distinguished scholars, Dr. Zenel Garcia in the Political Science Department and Dr. Abye Assefa from the Sociology Department. Dr. Garcia is a visiting assistant professor in the Government Department here at St. Lawrence University, and through a joint degree program, he earned his MA in Asian Studies in 2014 and a PhD in International Relations in 2018 at Florida International University. His research focuses on the intersection of international relations theory, security, and geopolitics. Specifically, how elites' understandings of state security and geopolitical environment shape the discursive and the empirical processes that lead to regional formation and transformation in the Indo-Pacific and Eurasia. And on my left, we have this distinguished Dr. Assefa. He's an associate professor and PhD from SUNY Binghamton, and he's a sociologist here at St. Lawrence, focusing on world historical change. His research interests include the historical nomadism, the formation of the Horn of Africa region in the modern world. His intellectual background includes world system analysis, social theory, sociology of economic change, structures of knowledge, and the peopling of Africa. Though his official academic discipline is sociology, he considers himself to be more in the realm of historical social sciences, and his appreciation for social historical phenomena is based on long-term and large-scale angle of vision. Accordingly, his presentation in this context will be in this context of terminal crisis of 500 years of old modern system. Now, to get us started, each faculty is going to have 5 to 7 minutes to introduce their perspective on the issue. And after that, we're going to delve into the meat of the issue and have a great conversation. So we're going to start with Dr. Garcia, and then we're going to circle back to Dr. Assefa.
Thank you for the introduction, Hammi. Basically, the Belt and Road Initiative is a grand-scale project that incorporates over 60 countries, a significant proportion of the world's population, and already about $1 trillion invested in 6 different economic corridors, overland corridors, and 2 maritime corridors. Now, the one that I'm focusing on today is the Central Asia, West Asia corridor that involves Chinese investments in Central Asia. And an interesting thing that we could probably begin our discussion with is the fact that the coverage of the Belt and Road Initiative in the West seems to focus significantly on the fact that is either a geopolitical mechanism for China to increase its influence around the world, or a geoeconomic one in which investment is going to be used to generate, obviously, political leverage down the line. And although both of those perspectives can give us some insight into what the Belt and Road Initiative could be about, it kind of misses the point of how the Belt and Road Initiative originates. And so while we might have the perspective that the Belt and Road Initiative is this macro national theory that the Chinese Communist Party has generated and is now projecting internationally, the origins of the Belt and Road Initiative actually begin with domestic policies, and particularly regional policies within China about how to engage their adjacent neighbors in the Eurasian continent. So we're actually, you're thinking about peninsular Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, the Russian Federation, and Mongolia, right? And what these were actually about were programs to generate development in some of China's most underdeveloped regions. So these are kind of like the frontier zones of China, which are majority regions that are not connected to the coastal developed provinces in China, right, which are already connected into global supply chains, which already have the human capital already there in the world's factories, so to speak. So if you're an international company, there's no incentive for you to invest in, let's say, central China, if you can just invest directly in a province like Guangzhou, like Guangdong province, because their ports are already there, the human capital is already there, the supply chains are already there. So what China essentially tries to do, beginning with the early 1990s, is begin to push a development policy along its frontier regions, and that it was actually officials leading these provinces, these groupings of provinces in China Southwest, Northwest, Northeast, to figure out what would be the most effective ways to generate economic development and then link that economic development with their neighbors. And so what we now see in the Belt and Road Initiative today is essentially kind of the more mature variation of projects that began in the 1990s and the early 2000s, which are now basically called the Belt and Road Initiative. So for example, when I speak about the Central Asia corridor, that corridor begins in the 1990s with the double opening strategy, which the whole point was to integrate Xinjiang more effectively to the rest of China, while simultaneously opening it up to trade with post-Soviet republics in Central Asia. In the early 2000s, now you have a national policy called the Great Western Development Strategy, which tries to bridge the gap between internal provinces and coastal provinces, in which, again, Western China is a core component of that. And so here, right, you build off of what came before. And so the Belt and Road Initiative builds off from that Western development strategy. So this is one of the reasons why a lot of the projects that are now under the Belt and Road Initiative actually originate before the 2013 announcement of the policy.
Wow. I was actually going to bring that up in terms of the history of it, because you mentioned that this is not something that started recently with Xi Jinping. So I was going to tell you to take us back into history and talk about Mao Zedong a little bit and how he started some of these initiatives. But we're going to circle back to Dr. Assefa so you can give us your perspective on this issue.
Okay, thank you. Okay, my take is a little bit different, because to me the most important thing is neither China nor Africa. Or if they are, it's more about the context, the time we are living in. Because right now, in my opinion, the system, the capitalist world system, the modern world system, historical capitalism, now it has entered, or it has been, for the last 3 decades or 4, in its terminal crisis, meaning it is dying. So we have to look at it from that perspective. What does it mean it is dying? It is dying not because the old way, capitalism versus communism, blah, blah. It's not that I'm talking. I'm talking about it is dying because the very essence of the capitalist system is the endless accumulation of capital or endless growth. It cannot stop. But now it has reached a point because the growth was in pursuit of profit. And since the 500 years time period, the profit rate has been gradually decreasing. And the last 40 years, it has reached a point where the cost is outstripping the revenue, so to speak. So the question is, what are the costs? The costs are the cost of the factors of production, in one way, or Polar is talking about the fictitious commodities. Basically, these are what is necessary to produce goods and commodities for the market. So those are like living entities, basically human beings, the natural environment, and the way they are organized. So those things have to be commoditized, but they are not commodities. They are living objects, but they have to be turned into dead objects. So if capitalism is turning everything constantly, endlessly into dead objects, but the factors that produces those dead objects, meaning the living factors, the factors of production, are not limitless. We have a limited amount of exploitable people. There is a limited amount of environmental resources. And you also have a limited amount of how much you reorganize people's and nature's way of producing stuff, the organization of production. So the commodities are, human beings are reduced into commodity labor. Nature is reduced into commodity land or resources, whichever, but it has a price. Labor has a price of wages. Nature has a price of rent, and the organization of the commodity form is money, but the return, the price of money is interest. So wage has been increasing over the years because the more capitalism goes, the more people demand for bigger remuneration payment, but the system has a way of expanding globally into different areas. For example, in China, I remember during the outsourcing, it was in China. Now China is no longer cheap, so they went to Bangladesh. So Bangladesh is no longer cheap. Now the system is coming to Africa. So sooner or later, they run out of places where the system can expand. What? In terms of research of labor. The environment also is not exploitable ad infinitum because there is a limited capacity of the environment. And the pressure is on the capitalists to pay for toxic waste, to pay for transportation, and to pay for recycling. They don't want to pay it, but there is a tremendous pressure for them to pay, and tax, the cost of money or of taxation is also rising, even though they don't want to pay taxes. You can hear all the time that the Republicans are saying we don't want to pay taxes, whatever. But they're going to end up paying taxes because taxes are necessary to maintain their power and the state's power. So even now, as we speak, the new president is talking about raising the taxes. So they have to raise the taxes. But in general, this system is the cost of wages, rent, and taxes are going up and up and up. And it is really eating out in the profitability of the system. That's why this system comes to an end. So when we speak about, in this context, about China to Africa, what are we to, if China, how is it going to become the next power? If you use the same paradigm, how the US became the hegemonic power, can you use the same thing to China? No, because now the system, instead of functioning the way it's now, is in decline. Is Africa going to be the same Africa that it used to be historically? No, it's not going to be, because the system is in decline. So China, when you talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, China is basically a different type of power, because the way they go about it is just like the old China, the imperial China. China is basically a transcontinental power, and Central Asia, because of they are following basically the Silk Road route. And what are they searching? I don't think the Chinese even know it. And the West doesn't know where we're heading. Nobody knows, because we are in this transition period. Whatever is going to happen, we have to go through this systemic chaos that we are going through. And probably in the next 10, 15 years, we might see a bifurcation. Either we might go this way, to a worse system than we have now, or we might go to a sustainable, better system this way. But that thing is being fought as we speak. So to me, this is how I look the future of China, Africa, the West, whatever.
Okay. So before we start talking about systems and the idea of investment and where investment is taking place and the implications of it, and whether or not the system itself is sustainable, we have to acknowledge the past, as in the fact that China's rapid growth and development has been one of the most astonishing phenomenon of our century. Nearly 800 million people out of poverty. Could you help us understand this a little bit and how this manifested itself? And then we'll jump into speaking about systems and understanding our world order as it is today.
Sure. those figures pretty much begin to take place after the 1978 reforms in China opening up. At this stage in China's development, right, the starting point was low. China had already undertaken a very comprehensive industrialization policy since 1949. It was very heavy industry focused, and it subsidized most of that heavy industrialization by essentially exploiting rural farmers. What it was essentially doing, of course, through the collectives, is artificially purchasing the grain and output of farmers, and then sell that product at internationally set prices, so that it could then purchase heavy machinery from the Soviet Union and then begin industrializing China. Right? The fundamental problem with this policy was that it didn't actually involve any kind of light industry. The reason why they kind of followed a heavy industrial model, which is copying the Soviet model at this moment, was that ideally this would have the highest connectivities between upstream and downstream industries. But again, this was predicated on a significant division of labor in the PRC. And so you could have some measure of industrialization, but this didn't necessarily lead to, the improvement of the quality of life of the average Chinese person writ large.
Yep.
Now, we could argue what quality of life means in a general sense, especially because we base that on, again, capitalist model. But beginning with 1978, of course, the commune system begins to break down, and the majority of the reforms actually take place in rural areas during the 1980s. The idea was that land would be redistributed once again to individual family households, production goes up, the government itself decides that it's going to pay a higher premium for that output, and that finally you could reinvest, any kind of excess output into private businesses. Villages begin to come together and invest in these things called township and village enterprises. So this is light industry, right? Where essentially all the farmers decide that they're going to allocate some land to continue farming, but some of that land is now going to be used for industrial purposes. They front their own money to put these light industries together, and this is where you start getting a lot of that economic activity. But getting people out of poverty, it's also kind of a hard question in the sense of how we're measuring poverty in the first place. Right? Like that goalpost has moved over the decades, but not at a rate that really means anything. So China brings 400 million people out of poverty, and we can argue that a significant number of those have really now entered middle class status. And so in China, this is about $10,000 US annually. Right. But when we speak about what is supposed to happen this year, which is the eradication of poverty in China, this is one of the centenary goals that the CCP has set for itself. What they're really talking about here is pulling 200-300 million people out of literally absolute poverty. Here we're talking about the $2 a day margin, right? Now this means something in China because, again, purchasing power is a little higher domestically in China. But in the grand scheme of things, this is still incredibly poor. And there's a massive disparity between what you would experience in a place like Shanghai to a very rural village in central China. And so definitely a lot of that has happened through reforms, and really what it really is state-led capitalism. Right. So far, this is the way that I would describe it. It's, we refer to China as communist China in American media all the time. It's communist in name only. In practice, really, the state is practicing state, managed capitalist model, which is definitely different than what we're doing here in the U.S. and some European countries. But that is how they've gotten 800 million people out of poverty and into middle class status. Right.
And so, Dr. Assefa, you study systems, right? And so,
well, I came from the world system or Emmanuel Wallace studies.
And so, is what he describes something that's replicable in other areas of the world? Because you talk about the system of capitalism, which is a system of initially the hungry eating the hungry, right? And so is this something that's replicable in other places to then pull their people into the middle class?
No. Okay. There were different systems. There are systems, for example, if you talk about the education system, it's a system.
Right.
You understand what I'm saying? But a system is basically an organized, living entity. For example, there is a difference between an open and closed system. A closed system is basically a self-regulating thermostat or a self-driving car program. An open system, it has to deal with this outside environment. It is not completely shut off. It has to be open just like our body is.
Right.
We are, but at the same time we interact with our, that's how we grow, and there is a beginning, a life, and you die. This is basically the cycle of an open living system. So these systems that we are living in, which is called the capitalist world system, what makes it unique is it is a world economy, just like world economies before it, but it is capitalist.
Right.
Meaning the other world economies in history, like before it, they worked, but after a while they transpire or change into what we call a world empires. You know? But this one changed into a whole type of different system, which is capital. So what brought it? For me, one of the biggest bang is the so-called discovery of the Americas. Because once the Americas were inducted into the world, basically the old world was basically completely dominated by landmass. The only sea was basically the Mediterranean. But all of a sudden, after the Americas came in, the flat world was becoming round, literally. You know, you have a whole new continent coming into the equation. The ocean has become much larger than the landmass. The whole thing has reshuffled. You understand? So the marginal area of the ancient world, of the pre-modern world, which was northeastern Europe, all of a sudden has become the center of the universe. You know, England, Holland, what have you. That is where the capitalist system, the core or the center there was it. But you have Africa, West Africa, and the Americas. Okay, that's how. And since the 16th century, it has been expanding, and by the beginning of the 20th century, it incorporated the entire world. So it was expanding, but its expansion was always fueled in search of accumulation. It accumulates by incorporating previously unincorporated area within the system. So how did it incorporate? Well, it incorporates, the first thing is external arenas, whatever you call them, they are incorporated into the system through different means, by colonialism, what have you. China, apparently, is one of the last areas to be incorporated, East Asia. They were incorporated at the very last of the 19th centuries. But why China is different? One is it is one of the last one to be incorporated with Japan and so on. But most importantly, China has been able to maintain its pre-modern political dynamics. Basically, China was not an agrarian empire. It was an agrarian because China is agricultural or whatever. But when you see the ruling class of the imperial dynasties, half and half. Half came from the nomadic North, the barbarians, and the other half were from China proper. So China was centered in the nomad sedentary relationship. That's why you have like the Great Wall of China. But when it was incorporated, it had never been uprooted from its nomadic relationship. But at the same time, when it came into transoceanic trade, China was also, by historical means, it has also exported its merchant diasporic community. You have the merchant diaspora and the imperial nomad, sedentary political system. The two will never converge. They don't see eye to eye, but the political always control the merchant, because the merchants is after, it's like Hong Kong. You know, southern China is basically the merchant class of China. They were actually, collaborating with the British, with the Opium War, and so on and so forth. But a good example would be with India. India has the same type of population, you know, but India could not resist invasions like China did. Why? Because India has a natural protection from Central Asia. You have the Himalayas. The only way you can come to India is through Pakistan, by that corner, the northwest corner, and every invader would come to India. And somehow they created this system of caste. It can never be ventilated. China has always been ventilated by the nomad-sedentary relationship. So that is basically the power of China. And the other thing, when you talk about China, China is not just like China proper that we know. China includes Japan. Japan was part of the greater system, the Chinese system. So now what you are looking at this moment, even though the Chinese government behave according to the capitalist norms, whatever they do, but when you see their rationale, it is not capitalist. Why would you invest in this road and belt stuff? I mean, any reasonable business person in the West, you wouldn't do that because they say it's too risky. But China is like an imperial power, you understand? And when they go to, for example, when they go to Africa, a lot of people are scared Chinese are coming to exploit Africa. The West did it. What makes you think the West is not looking for the same thing? What is the difference between China and the West when it comes to Africa? At this moment, the West wants chaos.
So you do believe that China is exploiting
Africa
everybody's exploiting
exploiting Africa,
and
but the solution
China's
is not
investments is, so what I'm trying to get at right here is like everybody's trying to exploit the African continent because it is attractive, it has a lot of great property. And so China's investment or involvement in the continent is driven by the idea of exploitation.
Of course, it's for their own self-reason, but when they come, the driving force is not the same as the West. The West has a historical trajectory, a historical, what do you call it, experience, whatever. So when the West come to Africa, it's a different, even now, when you speak, they come to lecture you, they come how to be democratic, blah, 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 blah. China, I'm from Ethiopia, I see them, they come down into the gutters. They come through, like, they are poor, like he says, so they can't go into, like, with the people. So the image that the Chinese have on the Africans and the Western have on the Africans is not the same. But most importantly, it's not the intention of the Chinese state that is important to me. Because the Chinese state behave rationally, consciously within the paradigm, the logic of the capitalist system. But what they actually respond to is to the period of transition that basically nobody knows. The West doesn't know, China doesn't know, Africa doesn't know where we're heading.
Okay.
We are heading forward by driving into the rear view mirror. What's going to happen if you drive forward by looking at the drive? You're going to crash.
Right.
This is how the knowledge structure is completely out of whack. We have to change because China, I don't believe that China is worse than the West. Let me tell you something. In a lot of sense, it might be even better because they do a lot of infrastructures, whatever, you know. But they are not also like they pretend to be, like this is a south to south friendship. No, it's not.
Okay. I wanna circle back a little bit to Central Asia and talk about investment and impact, right? So China is investing through the Belt and Road Initiative. You defined it for us in the beginning of your presentation. Could you take us through some of the investments that are being made in the region? How is it transforming the region? What are some of the implications? And help the audience understand what is going on?
Sure. Pretty much around the first decade of the 21st century, since around that time till about 2-3 years ago, the amount of money that China has invested in Central Asia has been near $400 billion. I mean, in the grand scheme of outward Chinese investment, this is kind of a blip during that same period of time, but for the region that we're talking about, Central Asia, this is massive, absolutely massive. And on the nature of that investment, it's pretty predictable, actually. It followed the same trend that it did in the African continent. It goes straight towards resource extraction. So a lot of the sectors that were originally invested on were hydrocarbon sectors, mineral sectors. Right. And one of the underpinning logics for this at this period of time was that Hu Jintao, who precedes Xi Jinping, had alluded to this issue that China had, which was called the Malacca Dilemma, the fact that China imported 90% of its hydrocarbons through the sea, that it goes through this choke point of the Straits of Malacca in Southeast Asia, and that, of course, who dominates the seas? The United States Navy. So in the potential, rivalry or conflict between these two countries, it would be pretty easy to kind of stifle energy flows to China, and of course, this could have cascading effects to collapsing economic productivity in China. So one of the ways that you could bypass this is through overland pipelines. So the Central Asia gas pipeline it's built in record time in 2009, 2011 to essentially supply China with basically 20% of its natural gas needs. And also, December 2019, the Power of Siberia natural gas pipeline is essentially going to provide another 20% of natural gas, but through northeastern China. So these are the early stages. Everything is in extractive sectors. What begins to really change, and this is something that I could possibly, connect with my colleague's points here, because he's making some very good points regarding this. What begins to change is a recognition, right, of if the logic of the Belt and Road Initiative, as I said in the beginning, is to lead to the development of the interior of China, right, to close this development gap between the coastline and the interior, then that development needs to be somewhat sustainable. It can't just all be state-led direct investment to this area. It needs to be kind of connected. And you can't really do this purely through resource extraction from your neighbors. At that moment, the development of interior China becomes contingent on the development of your neighbors, because that becomes the new supply chains, that becomes your new markets, right? It's almost like the new area to exploit and sell market, things too, in a way. I do think that they operate very differently than Western powers. I mean, the African continent alone, there's always this discussion of, Chinese debt trap and all of this stuff.
I was going to bring that up in a bit.
In the last 10 years alone, China accounts for 10% of African debt. 90% of it clearly comes from somewhere else. It's not coming from China, right? And if we're going to look for a debt trap in any part of the Belt and Road Initiative, you're not going to find it, because empirically speaking, what we found so far is that when countries are in danger of defaulting vis-a-vis China, predominantly what it does is that it restructures those loans. Either it outright forgives the debt, or it just defers payments at a later time. That's something that most African countries and Asian countries have simply not engaged with when it comes to the IMF and the World Bank and other Western investors. I'm not trying to paint China as here as this benign knight in shining armor, but it's clearly operating differently.
Right.
Right. When imperialism and colonization of the African continent and Southeast Asia, South Asia, and even Central Asia by the Russian Empire happens, this is purely a one-way relationship. You're just extracting resources and pulling them out. And I would argue that initial stages of Chinese investment could reflect something like this, but this doesn't seem to be that the Chinese government is thinking about it. These investments need to work because this is what's going to help the interior of China develop. And the reason why the interior of China and its development matter is because the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, inherently believes that economic development is what leads to political stability. Its survival is predicated on this.
Right.
And if we want to make a historical connection to this, I think this would kind of help me connect with my colleague here. You know, if we go back to dynastic cycles in China, and we can, use the concept of the mandate of heaven, which is used a lot in discussions about, Chinese empires. The mandate of heaven is not like divine right. In Europe, the mandate of heaven can be lost, and literally anybody can have it. And so you have the mandate of heaven when you provide public goods. This meant you upkeep the roads, the granaries are full in case that there's a drought or there's any natural disasters. And when those things are not happening and the natural disasters happen, right, drought, flood, whatever, and there's nothing in those granaries, that emperor and that dynasty is basically in shaky ground.
Right.
And so from the CCP's perspective, sure, it's an authoritarian regime, and yeah, it can go pretty brutal if it wants to, and it does. But at the core of what it sees that it needs to do is provide those public goods, bring people out of poverty.
I had another colleague of yours make the argument that the Chinese population is okay with the CCP as long as it keeps providing economic growth.
That's the bargain, right? The bargain is you don't open the door of political reforms, you can get rich.
Right.
Right? And that's the promise. The promise that your generation is going to do better than the generation before it because look at all the things that have fundamentally happened. I mean, you could find a person in China that's, 80, 90 years old. That person has made it through some of the most tumultuous moments in the 20th century, right? The transition from empire to a broken, nation state that devolves into warlordism, that is invaded, right? Goes through World War II. It goes through the Cultural Revolution, the Great Famine before that, and then now this, reform period. And so that person can look at their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and visibly see that each and every step has improved the quality of life. And so, yeah, in many ways, I would argue that the CCP's, survival is predicated on two things. The provision of public goods, this is economic development. The other one is basically fostering a particular brand of nationalism.
Right.
That would be the other part.
Right. And so I wanted to circle back a little bit because, and you mentioned earlier that China is better than the West because it provides some form of infrastructure. And you also mentioned that about like the debt trap is really not as concerning for you because like only 10% of the debt in Africa comes from China. And so I was looking into this article that a colleague shared with me, and it's about Sri Lanka's decision in 2017 to grant a 99-year concession to China on the Hambantota port, and agreed that Chinese merchants could hold the port, acquiring 70% of the port's operating company. And so this is used to kind of highlight the concerns about the excessive debt burdens and kind of legitimize it. And so to go back to Africa as well, there's colleagues of yours like Professor Patrice Lumumba, who is a renowned African scholar that is always warning African audiences about China. And he says things like, we have to be careful. He says things like, China is a danger to the continent if we are not careful in 25 years, right? And all of us will be speaking Mandarin, and he talks about the cultural changes that's taking place. And so are these burdens and concerns about China legitimate? Because these are also concerns that have been issued by Japan, the EU, the US, who are formulating their own response to Beijing, or their own alternative investments, or whatever you want to call it, to Beijing's activities. And so, does anybody want to take me up on that?
Look, for me, okay, neither China nor the West are saints. They are after their own interests.
Right.
The point is how they behave.
Right.
They don't behave the same way, because if you look at the generic behavior of a state, and then in abstract way, you have equal differentials. This is how, by nature, a state acts. Where, but a state acts within the context of its historical trajectory and the time period that it lives in. So, why is China different than the West? When it comes to Africa, for example, Africa, people are worried Africa is going to be trapped in the date. Who created this condition for Africa today? The Washington Consensus.
Right.
The West created it.
Right.
They are with the structural adjustment, the IMF, they completely destroyed the continent. Everybody was up to here.
Right.
Even the US itself is in China's debt trap. I don't know how much money we owe.
Right.
You understand what I'm saying? So everybody is in it, but somehow when it comes to Africa, the disease is much more pronounced. It is not that we have a debt. We have a debt. Africa owns more to other parties than it is.
Right.
But when you look at Africa at this moment, how is the West is dealing with Africa? Militarily, you have the French army, the US army, they are
French
all
in
there.
Mali and
China, they have only one port in Djibouti. At least they are not dealing it in an aggressive, militaristic way. Not because they are innocent bystander or genuinely Confucian, whatever. They are basically have another tool in their toolbox, and that is the tributary system. Basically, the granary. It's a tributary system, China. Tributary means it goes up, the income, whatever, then you distribute it through tributes.
okay.
The West is not a tributary system. The West is a capitalist system, and when it deals with strangers, it's either us versus them. China always think what we call it, the central government, the heaven, what we call it? The center. But whoever comes, China is being ruled by Mongols, by different barbarian tribes. But even when Chinese pay tribute to them, the Chinese are paying. They use the same term that they use that the others are paying them. It's the same term they use. So when they pay, unless you are very careful, they are the Chinese who are paying, but they make it sound that the others that they are paying to are dependent on them. So they have this way of dealing with the other. The West doesn't have it.
Right.
It's either or. That's why race is completely an ocean-created concept of historical capitalism. There was no race before.
Right.
It's a new thing. So this is how the West deals with geographical differences. China has a different idea. You understand?
Yeah. And then Dr. Garcia, do you want to speak on this before we move on to the next question?
I mean, when it comes to investment and debt, every country should certainly have concerns about the amount of debt that it takes in. Look, we do have research that indicates that there's really no significant, there's a lot of discussions that China's investment is predatory. We have no proof that Chinese investments fail at a higher rate than any other investor, so that's
right.
Categorically untrue.
Okay.
As far as the test case that's always used for the debt, trap, there's a Hammi port in Sri Lanka. People forget that the initial, viability research that was done on whether this port would actually be economically feasible and viable were conducted by Western firms. They just refused to put in the money. China came in last minute and said, "Sounds great, we'll build it."
Right.
And essentially what you have in Sri Lanka is two state-owned enterprises, one that runs the Colombo port, which sees significantly much higher flow of container, movement, and Hammi, which doesn't. And so what this new state-owned enterprise figures is that, well, it is still strategically located. And rather than making this a port that just is there as a transit point where people come in, refuel, restock, and move on, we're actually going to begin to offshore Chinese enterprises into these industrial parks in Hammi, and then ship from there. It cuts the transit time. So actually, this gets back to my colleague was saying earlier, where you're just offshoring things that become more expensive in the mainland elsewhere. Central Asia actually does provide an interesting case study also about how some of these countries manage their debt too. Ultimately, if you're in the African continent, who's coming with offers of lending anymore, realistically speaking, right? So the United States and the OECD countries can complain about it all they want, but who's actually willing to lend at any other terms, right, that are desirable for these countries? So, China's really the only player in this case. And so in this kind of scenario, if you look at Central Asia, these countries clearly have the attention of the Russian Federation. These are post-Soviet states, so they're definitely interested. For some reason, the EU was also incredibly interested in Central Asia. The Americans only cared while Afghanistan was at the height of the conflict, and so once that stopped mattering, Central Asia went back to being a black hole in American geopolitics. But if you're, for example, Kazakhstan, you have the attention of Beijing, you have the attention of Moscow, you have the attention of Brussels. And if you play your cards right, you can basically play everybody off and get greater concessions. So when the Belt and Road Initiative was announced, the first thing that Nazarbayev, the former president of Kazakhstan, did, he came to DC. And he went straight to GE and said, we're now going to have all these railways being built in Kazakhstan. We want you to build a plant in Kazakhstan to build the engines, the train engines in Kazakhstan. And we want that tax transfer. So now because Chinese are investing billions of dollars in railways in Kazakhstan, they were able to get that concession from GE, which they would have never gotten if somebody else wasn't investing. So in other words, of course countries should be concerned about how much debt they take, but if they're playing their cards right, they can play the great powers too, right? They have agency too. This is something that people forget. Like small countries, they have agency. They have the capacity to pull things in their direction as well.
That reminds me of Ahmed Sékou Touré. He's like the first independent president of Guinea, and how during the Cold War he was playing the Americans and the Russians and trying to get favorable terms from both sides. You spoke about Kazakhstan a little bit, so another question that I wanted to ask you as a political scientist, is there a similarity between, because you mentioned earlier that China is invested in about like 60 countries or more, right? Is there similarity between the kinds of countries that China is investing in? As in, are there federal states, unitary states, democracies, totalitarian? Because for Central Asia we have Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan, and then in Africa we have the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is plagued by war right now. We have Angola, Ethiopia, South Africa, Mauritius, Uganda, Tanzania, endless. So is there like a similarity between these states? Or is it that they're all just underdeveloped? Is that the only similarity?
I think so. Again, the Belt and Road Initiative is really guided by two documents, and those documents are sparse in specifics, and that's intentional. Because anybody can essentially join the Belt and Road Initiative, and the Belt and Road Initiative can mean anything that any of the participating countries want it to be. At its core, what the Chinese government wants is a recognition that every country has a development strategy. And what they want is, how do you match a country's development strategy with China's, and then let's cooperate in those areas. What that means in practice, they don't care who joins the Belt and Road Initiative. That said, I would argue that there is a hierarchy of which countries matter most. And I would argue that countries that directly border China definitely matter the most, because any instability and underdevelopment across the border is going to have cascading effects domestically in China. The further away you get from China proper, things change. Each corridor of the Belt and Road Initiative, it kind of takes a life of its own based on the countries that participate in it too. Because again, they're not selling a universalist Washington model, so to speak, in this case. They're trying to, get it to work based on local conditions. This is actually I would argue this is probably the most important aspect of the Belt and Road Initiative, or what Chinese foreign policy really presents now in the 21st century. It is this, if you look at statements by Xi Jinping and other, major CCP officials. You'll see the same narratives over and over again, right? Respect for development, difference in development models, respect for difference in governance models, right? This fight against universalist global values. What's really interesting here is that they're not saying it explicitly, but what they're really saying is we're not the West.
Right.
We're not, you don't need to be democratic, and you do not need to actually follow the Washington Consensus to develop. You can do whatever you like. Interestingly enough, even though it is selling this very inclusive kind of policy abroad, it does actually possess some universalist foundation in it, right? Which might get us closer to what you were referring to. They have their own worldview, they have their own idea. And here, one of the things that has emerged in recent years is, I believe it's the International Liaison Department, which connects the CCP with parties and political figures around the world. And they host workshops, essentially to collaborate on governance, it's a learning mechanism, so to speak. And so the idea of this particular department is essentially to sell what China is selling, right? And so it's not explicitly saying there is a Beijing consensus. They'll tell you that it's inclusive, anybody can partake, but that they are saying that, hey, look, our model is different and it has worked so far, right? You might be able to learn something from it.
So we have 5 minutes left or less. I have like so many questions. I wanted to ask questions about territorial disputes and China and Russia both having an interest in the region. But we can't clearly address all of these issues. So I want to give each one of you 2 minutes to close up and offer some perspective, some last minute perspective or things for people to think about. We even had some audience questions that we're not going to get to. 2 minutes of your closing statements or whatever you want to offer to the audience, and then I'll ask some audience questions and then we'll end it.
Sure. Mine is just like, look, for me the most important thing now is we are actually addressing a Western audience because we are in Western, the United States. But one of the things that needs to be really confronted here is the hegemonic outlook of the structures of knowledge. Because when you talk about, for example, it's very common, totalitarian, communist, democratic, whatever, we already assume that we are not totalitarian, we are not democratic, we are not that, we are not that. So everybody that is not Western might be there. But one thing you have to understand, the West has never been democratic. The best time of democracy where women and social minorities were completely excluded from the political stage. As soon as they were included, boom, the world revolution of 1968 happened. You understand? Democracy work, not liberal democracy is not to include. Ideally, yes, but in actuality, it is very effective in excluding. The West does not control societies by military means. It is much more efficient in controlling by police means. Who does the policing? In China, you see the government deploying people. Here, everybody is policing everybody, along ethnic, racial, whatever. Like. The whole thing about this post-colonial bullshit that we're talking about, I'm telling you, it's just like nobody likes them, nobody anymore. It's who you are. It's not what you say that matters. Who are you? Can we talk about women if you are a man, white if you are black? So everybody is in little boxes, you understand? We cannot come out of that. The Chinese model, at least at this moment, it has to be taken seriously, not because it's better, whatever. It gives you a different angle of vision from the already well-established and redundant paradigms that has been anchored here. So that's what I say.
Okay. So pay attention because that's an alternative to the already existing systems.
Yeah.
Okay. And then Dr. Garcia?
I would argue that that really is what we really need to focus on. I mean, the Cold War as long as it lasted, the focus is definitely by the two superpowers was on these military means, military components. But the Cold War was not really about that. It was an ideational struggle. That's really what it was at the heart of this thing. Right here you have two Western philosophies about the good life. How do we get modernity? So two competing ideas of modernity, two competing ideas on how to bring about good life, but they're both Western, really, at the end of the day. And so, the United States comes out in 1991, right, and it has this unipolar moment, and it sees itself as the victor and as leading the camp of this liberal international order, right, however it defines it. And it sees any difference to this liberal order as fundamentally threatened. And it is here where China actually presents, right, this monster for the United States. It's not the fact that China's military is modernizing. You have two nuclear powers. The moment you go to war, everybody dies. It's not really about military, confrontation. It's really about the fact of what happens, what really happens, if a country emerges with a fundamentally different idea of an international order, and that idea begins to take hold, right, and becomes dominant, or at least challenging, in ways that the Soviet Union could never actually do, right? Because the United States understands that kind of struggle. That's why it's thinking of containing China now. It's literally playing the same exact strategy. Every other Western analyst on this is it's literally writing about the same bullshit discourse. The next Cold War, containment of China. I'm like, yeah, that toolkit has been used, and it doesn't make sense for the current context at all, actually. China's a very different thing than the Soviet Union was. And what's really interesting for someone like myself who studies China and its relationship in the world is that we can call China's foreign policy statements, CCP propaganda. But what matters is that enough people in the global south buy it. And if they buy it, right, they begin to actually see, right? They begin to really compare what does the West offer versus what China's order offers, and where do we see ourselves better off, right? So what happens if that shift happens, or if it gets close to that? How does the United States respond to that?
We're being told that we're out of time, so these were
You're the bad guy now.
right. We're being told that we're out of time, so we don't have time for audience questions. But these are some great and interesting perspective that were just presented to you. Please listen, take notes, do your homework, pay attention, and formulate your own worldviews. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for coming and offering us all these great ideas. We'll see you soon. Thank you.